Hi, everybody. Welcome to our most recent Talking Church episode here at Brentwood. Today's guest is Melissa Florer-Bixler, an author, theologian, and pastor at Raleigh Mennonite Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Her work has been very influential on Emily and me, and we are so glad to welcome you here today. Melissa, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Phil. It's great to be here with you.
Just to kind of begin, could you tell us a little bit about your forthcoming book that is on enemies? What's it about, and what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy also that book is currently with the editor, being edited. So grateful to sort of have that out onto the next step. But yeah, I started this book with, I think in all of my writing, the questions that I have, I think probably other people have those questions too. So this is more of a invitation to invite people into the ways that I'm thinking about things and the discoveries that I have. And then hopefully this will be another part of that journey forward. And in this particular moment that we're in right now as a country, as a church, as a world, I think we hear a lot of different things about what it means to have enemies. And so one of those streams could be that we don't actually have enemies in Christianity, that our unity in Christ or who we are together erases the possibility of enmity. But then we also have Jesus who says, love your enemies. So there must be enemies out there if Jesus says we have to love them. And then we also have these messages about how enemies are people who we hate or rage against, or we long for their destruction, and we can sense something is amiss about that. And then we have this robust tradition of enemies in the Hebrew Bible. That's also a part of our Christian tradition. So it feels like there's always so much going on when we come to this question. And I really felt that I wanted to sort that out for myself, all these sort of things that were coming at me, because how we have enemies, it has a lot to do with the kind of solidarities that we're going to have. It has a lot to do with what it means to be followers of Jesus. And this, I think there was really a shift for me, as I think there was for a lot of people in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. And I was one of those people who was really shaken by that, and kind of felt like the rug was pulled out from under me, and sort of very overnight, literally overnight, went from feeling like I knew the country that I lived in, and to not really having a grasp on the way that the world functioned. And over the course of those 4 years of work to really try to do everything that our church could to confront the kind of violence and destruction that was coming out of the Trump administration, one of the moments for us as a congregation is that we raised bail to get someone out of an ICE detention center, a woman who had been put in detention, fled as a political refugee, was claimed asylum, and was put in detention. And through this process, I realized, oh, wow, being in solidarity means to make this person's enemies my enemies. And so I had to figure out what that meant. What did it mean? Now that I really had this conviction that enemies were a part of the work of solidarity, what did it mean to have them well? And so I'm hoping that this book can be an invitation for us to begin to ask that question together.
Thank you. Emily and I have especially been drawn to your work, like leading up to the election, and now even kind of in these post-election times. I've heard lots of people say things, pre and post-election. Like, we just need to listen to one another and understand different perspectives. And if we all can just understand one another better, then we could just all get along much better. What's your reaction to statements like this?
I'd like to see evidence of that, and I think the problem is that I don't. Which isn't to say that people don't change. I am committed as a person who has changed many times in my own life to people being able to change. But But we have not seen in history a collective movement of freedom that is based on people individually being talked out of their position. It's sort of this, the starfish on the beach that you throw back in, and if that's great for individual conversion. But I don't think that we actually see movements of solidarity and movements of justice happen in that way. And in fact, what we've actually seen is the opposite. So in 2016, we were hearing the same thing we are hearing now. If we just listen to each other, if we have these conversations, if people understood, it was those same conversations. And I'm assuming that for the past 4 years, people have been doing that, right? They have been talking to their family members, and they've been building relationships, and they've been going to church, and they've shared about what's important with them. And as we know, what happened is that more white Christians voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than 2016. And this is in light of this cascade of white supremacist destruction. Our community suffered from ICE raids where people were disappeared at traffic stops and in their workplaces. We saw child separation at the border, a 300% rise in anti-Jewish violence. And so I think it's important for us to remember that this is not the first time we're hearing this. We heard this before. And then in light of everything we've seen, we actually saw the white church dig deeper into I think the lie and the self-service of white supremacy in the Trump administration. The other thing that I think is a historic piece for us to hold in mind is that we are also not one generation removed from the time when white fathers were pouring bleach into public pools to keep Black children out of them. We are not even one generation removed from buses being bombed by white churchgoers who wanted to prevent Black people from registering to vote. And we are not one generation removed from white mothers spitting on children as young as 6 years old, trying to get into their schools to integrate them for the first time. And so I think the question for me when I hear, just give us more time, we just need more conversation, if we just understand how long, right? That refrain from the Psalms, that how long, O Lord? And this is, I think, the question for the church right now. How much more do you need to see? How much more dialogue before we're willing to actually say, this is not a strategy that is working for us? And I know that especially in this, where it feels like we're now in crisis, I know that I just do not have the disposition to spend time experimenting with personal conversion when there is so much work to do in actually building this new world and inviting people into it.
Not long ago, you tweeted, quote, the idea that all our conflicts are misunderstandings or reduced to interpersonal issues, or that we need to talk things out behind the scenes. Well, that's good for only one group of people, men in power. It is not pacifism, and it has a deep history of violence. Could you unpack this for us?
Yeah, this definitely makes me think I'm going to be really careful about what I tweet in the future, since I'll be asked to give an account for myself. So I'm really grateful for that accountability in this space, first of all. But yeah, no, I now that I hear that again, I still think that's true. And I think it's important to remember I'm from the Mennonite Church. So I'm from a tradition that is a pacifist tradition. And oftentimes what that has meant for us is we use this language of being the quiet in the land, which is really how can we just remove ourselves from the conflicts of the world. And the Mennonite Church is also a church that went from having very radical social and political positions to really being subsumed largely into the whiteness of the United States and being able to get by. And so a little bit of this is sort of from my own tradition, from the Mennonite Church. But I do think there are things for all of us and who are in the church to be aware of when we use this language. And when I talk about enemies in the book, the first thing to do is always like, what are we talking about, right? What is this thing that we call enemies? And when I talk about enemies, I am not talking about disagreement. Enemies are relationships of disproportionate power, or people who have become enemies out of solidarity with people who are experiencing disproportionate power. So you always have a relationship where power is a part of the dynamic. And I continue to see that power is one of the most neglected conversations that we have in the historically white church. And until we talk about power, I don't think that we can actually understand what it means to have enemies, to disagree, to have conflict. Because misunderstanding for me is a word that assumes that power is equal. That's just difference, right? If there's nothing on the line between you and me, Phil, it's just an interpersonal argument. That doesn't mean we're enemies. It just means we disagree with each other. And we have to be able to distinguish this from people who live in systems of both passive and active harm. And to recognize that there are people who actually make up these systems, right? It's people who make up these systems. And one of the ways that I think that we scaffold and activate systems of oppression is by reducing it to a misunderstanding. Because the only people who thrive within the current system are benefited by that reduction, right? Like if we just talk about the personal, it never is actually going to impact the larger system that people are a part of. And we know that we live in a caste system, right? Where the top of that system are straight, white, temporarily able-bodied men. And that's how power has been structured always in this country. And at the bottom of that, right, in descending order, you have proximity or distance to the people at the top. And that's Isabel Wilkerson's incredible book, Caste, is just so useful for elucidating that. But it's obfuscating that power at work among us that keeps hierarchies in place. You never actually deal with the hierarchy. You just deal with the relationship. And we cannot dismantle the thing that we can't even acknowledge that it's real. And I think for people of faith, when we actually look at Jesus, we don't have this Jesus who is meek and mild, and I think we like running through the fields with lambs and holding babies, right? Like these are oftentimes the sort of like preschool children's Bible image of Jesus that we get. And when we dig deeper, there's like some really intense and troubling moments that Jesus has with his enemies and with people who are in disagreement with him, and both of those kinds of relationships. But Jesus is not very tolerant. He is not accepting. He doesn't treat enemies as just, we just need to kind of figure this out together. Instead, Jesus comes up with this rather absurd interruption to the way people do their daily lives. He undermines business opportunities and patron-client relationships, and he upends what people do with their money and how they think about poverty and strangers, and people redistribute their wealth. This is good news for people's lives. And so at the end of the day, I think that's the question for us. Like, is this good news, and who is it good news for?
Jesus talks a lot about, loving enemies. And so, at what level does loving our enemies mean keeping them accountable?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think part of this is accountability. And that accountability happens within a broader framework of how, of recognizing that our enemies also participate in their own destruction. right? That's when we love our enemies. It is also because we are willing to name that people who live in harm of others are actually perpetuating a world that is bad for all of us. So whenever Jesus tells these stories about hell and eternal destruction, the first thing I think is, oh, I know people who live like that right now. They are living in hell. Their lives are dominated by greed and hoarding and resource theft. People who have no shut-off button to when is enough enough? When do I have enough? And it's this constant race for more, constantly living in fear of becoming religious minorities or racial minorities. Like, that is a bad life to live. And so one of the ways that I think we can live as Christians is to recognize that people foist this terror upon themselves. One of the places where I think we see this the most clear-eyed is in the book of Revelation. I've a few years ago, our church did a study on Revelation. I tend to every once in a while issue myself a personal challenge to pick up and do a Bible study on a book that I really just feel uncomfortable with, just to try to like kind of help myself kind of like figure out what's underneath that. And one of the things that I really got from this last study that we did on Revelation is that God doesn't need to throw down lightning bolts or, raise up floods from the earth. We have everything we need to destroy ourselves. We have everything we need. And Revelation is actually the vision of a world where we have been given over to ourselves. And look around us. We have all the poverty and environmental destruction and war to easily take ourselves out with no active role from God. And so recognizing that creating a world without enemies is actually good for our enemies and for us. So I was thinking about just maybe like a more concrete example of this might be the forms of masculinity we see in our culture. And the expectations that men in our culture live with, that you center your life on earning money, you don't show emotion, there's invulnerability, even to the point of refusal to acknowledge mental and physical health conditions as if this is a form of weakness, right? And we know that this is bad for women and children who become victims of domestic violence, of hostile workplaces, of sexual harassment. But what we also know is that this is bad for men, right? This is a bad world for men. It's bad for men to live with the truncated self-sufficiency, and it's bad for men's souls. It is this moral wound to participate in the destruction of others. And so we want to make this new world that leaves behind these old orders, because sin and death is bad for all of us. And we are wrapped up in our mutual destruction. And I think, getting back to that question about accountability, when we have an abuser or an oppressor, we recognize that you can both participate in your own destruction and need to be held accountable for that, right? Like, I think there's this sense sometimes, maybe in the progressive church, that it has to be one or the other, right? Like that we either, people are just victims of their circumstances or there's accountability. But I actually think we need accountability more than ever when we have this sort of loving our enemies framework. Because we can really only begin to talk about the reign of sin and death if we call people to account for their participation in it, and to create new ways of living together that invite them out of that and into a new world that maybe they cannot even imagine for themselves right now.
Yeah. One of the things that the disciples of Christ talk a lot about is unity. And we are grounded in this idea that Christ holds us together in the midst of our differences. And unity has been called the disciples of Christ's polar star. I think a lot about the calls to unity that I've heard here after the election, especially whenever you hear Christian calls for unity and such in these times or any other time, what comes to your mind?
These calls from unity, I think, can issue from two different places. And I think one option is one that we are seeing more in the historically white church, where unity really is washing away differences that cause tension or friction, right? We don't want to come into church and to feel badly about the person sitting next to us because of who they voted for. So that's really, I think, the most popular, as you were saying, Phil, version we're seeing is no matter who you voted for, we're siblings in Christ. That's sort of the language that we're hearing, which works out really well if nothing in your material life is affected by politics, right? If your next meal or clean water or your deportation or whether or not you get health insurance is unaffected by the election, then it really is easy to see these as ideological differences, right? Like we have different ideas about the national debt. Like, what does that actually do to affect our daily lives? Probably marginal. But that is not the case for the vast majority of people who live in this country. Politics is life or death, and it is not just the voting booth. It is every single day. So I think the question for us is, what does it mean about the kind of unity we proclaim when we're willing to say that what unites us has actually makes no difference in other people thriving, but is really just a set of common principles? That does not sound like good news. That just sounds like quietism. I do think we're hearing, though, a different kind of call for unity from the Black church, from queer affirming churches, from activist communities. And that is this real robust unity that begins with acknowledging harms and then begins to work towards reparation and repair, right? So the question on my mind, and that I think should be on the mind of every white pastor right now, is, how can I unify my church around stamping out the disease of Trumpism? That should be the question that we are unified around right now. Not saying, how is my interpersonal relationship with the person next to me impacted by who we voted for, the yard sign that we had out front. And I think we'll continue to see quietism and avoidance of conflict rather than the gospel of Jesus Christ if we are not willing to begin to acknowledge the harms that came for a vast majority of underserved and vulnerable communities. Yeah, and this, gets, I think we see the sort of tension here in these unity services on Election Day. I went back to the website for the Election Day Communion, and it talks about the rancor and bitterness of this election season. And then it goes on to talk about the need to participate in holy acts of union and reconciliation. And as I read that, I went back and sort of went through the communion liturgy in my mind. And what we know is, before you take communion, you confess, right? Yeah, that is traditionally what we do. We have confession before union and reconciliation. And so I think the question for me is, what does that mean on Election Day and every day that follows Election Day? If it's nothing more than being sorry for sending your colleague an angry email or yelling at your kid in the morning, but not propping up a white supremacist regime, I think we should pause and ask ourselves what we're doing.
I was somewhat surprised that even more U.S. Americans supported Trump in 2020 than in 2016. And it's made me think about a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. But one thing that you wrote recently that really stood out to me, at one point you wrote that there are limits to empathy, and we get the things we organize to take, not by changing minds. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
Sure. It's important to me that we look back on our history and see and honor the work that has been done before us and the work that's being done now in the movement. Um, and this is a consistent theme, again, is that we do not get changes in the work of justice and liberation because people spend their time trying to convince people to people in power, specifically white people, to change their minds. And so I think the most salient example of this is I often hear or was hear and continue to hear after some of the George Floyd protests involved breaking windows or rocks being thrown at police officers. I would hear every once in a while, we need a new MLK. We need somebody to really unify these movements around these nonviolent principles, someone to like really bring people together and guide the movement in the way MLK did. I always kind of chuckle a little to myself because MLK had a 90% disapproval rating in almost every period of his activism. People considered him divisive and violent. Like, this is what I don't think people always understand. Because he instigated a violent reaction, he was part of the problem. That was not considered nonviolent, not from the perspective of the white community and the white church, especially, who was watching what was going on. People said that he was moving too fast, that this was a radical agenda. We have the letter from a Birmingham jail that's written in response to this long letter that these pastors and rabbis sent, telling him to slow down, to work, to all of these things that we are hearing again today. If you just sat down and had conversations with people, if you just gave us more time, if we just move slower, right? And so I think we continue to have this sort of idealized view of how the civil rights movement happened that actually doesn't have any place in the reality of what the movement was like then. And that's because I think what we know is that empathy is a powerful tool, right? It is an incredibly powerful tool. And so is ideology. And whiteness is an incredibly powerful tool. And so is fear. So is Fox News. We have so many things that are all tools that people are utilizing to and so this sort of idea that the most powerful tool is empathy. And if we just sat down and understood each other, that somehow that could overcome this fear and this ideological sort of shift that we're seeing. That I think that is overstating both the power of empathy and doing it in a way that actually does disservice to people who struggle every day and who are tired of waiting. Who are tired of waiting and want co-conspirators for the work of liberation in people like us who have not historically suffered in the same ways. So these powerful forces lead people to make choices that cause death and destruction to themselves and to the people that they love, right? We see this happening all around us. How do you compete with that with empathy? And instead, I think what I'm hopeful for, again, is that we build a world that's good for people, that is good for creation, that lives into this robust imagination for the reign of God. And then that is the only way that I know to signal to people who have chosen the side of enmity, to know that we are for them. Look and see what is waiting for you here.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think as a pastor, about the best ways forward, for pastors, for congregations. And so, like, if you had any advice for progressive congregations and pastors in this post-election world, what would it be?
The question that really centers a lot of my work in my congregation is not so much about sort of what's the most important social issue of the day. I think all those things can be really overwhelming because there's so much work to do, right? And I think especially progressive congregations can maybe begin to feel overwhelmed by that having to choose, or and instead the question that I ask is, how do we develop a robust community of discernment? Like, how do we discern among ourselves? And that means, I think, for us, creating cultures that allow for conflict to be a place of growth, that create opportunities for us to deepen our life as followers of Jesus, rather than something that cuts off relationship, right? And so I think there is so much fear of conflict right now, because it almost feels like the table has gotten so wide, right? That this sort of big table, how do you even begin to have a conversation, right? And so one of the things I talk about in the book is, how do we know the difference? How do we discern between difference and enmity, right? Getting back to that question in the beginning. What are the things that there is space for us to work this out together, right? Between you and me, there are 1,000 different ways that we could do this work. And there's places where I need to come to you and you need to come to me. And that's not eliminated, because we are willing to say that at a certain point, there are things that are no longer tolerable for our congregational life. And that actually the goal of our churches is not to be sort of a hospital where the most vulnerable and oppressed people in our communities have to sort of wait around for people to decide that they want to be for them. But what if it was actually a refuge? What if the church was called to be a safe place for people to land who every day go into work and don't know if they're going to get fired because of the person that they're married to, for who every day wonder if they're going to send their child out to get shot and killed by a police officer in a traffic stop. Like, what if we were actually instead saw ourselves as a place of nourishment and rest, and resistance, and work together, and that's what Jesus does. That's the community that Jesus calls people to. It is not a place of perpetual destruction of neighbors and hoping for the best generation after generation. It's a place where Jesus robustly calls people to lay down their old lives and to figure out what it means to live into this new life. But first you have to lay down the first thing, right? That's the first part. So how do we discern that, would be the first question. And sort of that related second question is, how do we just live into this kind of Christ-like absurdity of these, of the, like, stretching our imaginations for these possibilities that I think often get limited by practicality, which, I'm sure, that's important too. But, I know there's this church in Philadelphia that they're forgiving each other's student loans. Our church is part of abolition work, where we are trying to imagine ways to be safe without putting people that we have grown to love in prison for the rest of their lives. And all of that comes from developing this imaginative space, and by listening carefully to the people who've come before us, who even before we knew it was possible said, no, there's something else out there. No, there's another world that's possible. And you may not know it yet, but we've put these little pieces here for you to follow, and you pick them up and you make something out of them now. And there are already people at work at this. And so we don't even have to figure this out on our own. We just have to join ourselves up with the work that's already happening. And that is joyful and creative and life-giving and good. And it is good for everyone. It is good for everyone. That is good news.
Now, that is inspiring. That is hopeful. Appreciate you sharing that so much, and appreciate your time with us today so much. I know Fire by Night, your book is already available everywhere books are sold. But what about your new book? It's in the editor's hands. Any guesses on when it might be available?
Yeah, that's July of 2021. It's just always amazing when you're actually in the book writing process, how long these things actually take. But I think pre-orders are going to be out soon, so you can keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I'm grateful for people who read it and are happy to be part of the conversation that we're all having together.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, the links are there for you if you want to learn more about the work of Pastor Melissa Florer-Bixler. Thank you so much from those of us here at Brentwood for taking time to share with us today.